In the big, beautiful year 2025, it seems like underground hip hop is in one of the weirdest spots that it's ever been in during its entire time existing as a genre. Now, wait, before you click off, no, you didn't pick the wrong video. I know I've made this statement before when talking about hip hop as a whole, but today I'm not trying to make big, sweeping generalizations of the entire genre. Instead, I'm only trying to focus on a specific piece of it, being the underground scene. Because while I and many others definitely have our fair share of issues when it comes to the mainstream rap industry, as you can see by how many videos have been made on the topic, it's not very often that you see people criticize the other side of the coin, which of course is the underground. And I believe the reasoning behind that is because a lot of people see it as the lesser of two evils. I mean, after all, everywhere where the mainstream fails, the underground seems to thrive. It's more creative, experimental, and a hell of a lot better than anything you can listen to on the radio. That is, if anybody even listens to the radio anymore in the big 2025, but take my word for it, I used to work at a place where they would play the exact same station for 10 hours in a row, and well, 90% of it was dog shit. Shout out to Shabuzi though, because the bar song was really the only thing that got me through. And I know you guys are gonna say coworker music, but like, no, literally, my coworkers were playing the music.
And 5 ain't working. Why the hell do I work so hard?
Now let's not get off topic though, because today I want to do the unthinkable and actually criticize the underground scene. Because while yes, I definitely agree it's a whole lot better than anything going on in the mainstream, it's not without its own faults. And even though we love something, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't want it to be better. If you're trying to diagnose the issue with rap as a whole, you can't only focus on half of the body and expect to find the full disease. You're gonna have to look at the entire thing. And if we're ignoring the underground, we're really doing ourselves a disservice. But right off the bat, we're already running into a bit of an issue because what even is the underground? Is it a movement, a genre, a community, a type of music, which I guess is what a genre is, but basically all of the above, while also none of them at the same time. Because if you ask 10 people what the word underground means, they're probably all going to give you different answers. Because after all, the entire underground movement, if you want to call it, is so broad that many different people interpret it in different ways. Which makes it really tough for us, because if we're going to try to figure out what's wrong with underground rap, knowing what it is in the first place is probably a pretty important step. So to make things a little bit simpler, I'm going to lay a couple ground rules. First of all, I'm only going to be focusing on hip hop or rap if you want to call it, because well, trying to cover every single genre of music that has ever been considered underground is way too broad of a topic for one video. So sorry to all of those underground rock bands who were performing in warehouses back in the 70s, you're not going to get a mention in this video, although I guess you just did, so there you go. I'm also not going to be talking too much about the pre-internet underground, because while it definitely is very influential on the type of music that we have right now, I don't think it's important to mention every single influential figure ever when talking about a specific scene. I mean, shout out to people like 3-6 Mafia as well as the Juggalos with groups like ICP and Twisted. They definitely did a lot to build the underground in its earliest days. But for the purposes of this video, I think starting around 2007 to 2010 is probably the best spot to look at, because in my opinion, that's really where the modern day underground was born. And that's all because the internet began to become a lot more popular around the time. Now don't get me wrong, it's not like it is nowadays where basically everybody in a first world country has access to the internet in one way or the other, and even a couple third world countries actually have access as well. It wasn't like the internet had taken over the entire world, but everybody between the ages to about 15 to probably about 35 were using it as part of their daily routine, and because of that, it was in kind of the sweet spot. Because there was just enough people online that it felt broad and far-reaching and interesting without being so large that it was overwhelming. And because of that, the early internet was basically broken down into a bunch of different niche subcultures, with some people being interested in stuff like anime, with it really booming outside of Japan at the time. Some people were interested in alternative fashion that was very different than what was popular at the time. Now, I'm not talking about dudes wearing dresses, although I'm sure that probably was happening at the same time. I'm more so talking about people who would take influence from different types of fashion and mix it all together. For example, you had people who took heavy influence from the goth aesthetic, and then they would go on to mix that with vintage clothing, creating their own style. You also had people who wanted to be vampires even back then, and then of course you had furries, but we're not going to get into that right now. And of course, people like that who are going to be willing to mix different types of fashion all together to create something unique are going to do something very similar when it comes to making music. Because even back in the ancient year of 2008, there were still people trying to use the internet to get their voices heard. As after all, prior to the internet, if you were kind of a weird person from a small town and there wasn't anybody in that town who really shared your interest, you were probably going to be pretty lonely, or you would have to adapt to the culture in that town or get left behind. But now with the help of the internet, you no longer have to focus on the people who just so happen to be around you. You can go online and find other weirdos like yourself and form a community with them. And that's exactly what we would start to see around 2009 to 2010 on apps like MySpace and Tumblr, with MySpace actually being the most popular social media at the time, and on top of that being heavily customizable where you could basically do whatever you wanted with your profile. On top of that, you didn't have to worry about future employers taking a look at your social media account, so you could basically do whatever you wanted with it without getting in trouble. It was the wild west of the internet, and it was also the wild west of early internet rap, if you even want to call it that. Because the earliest forms of internet music that can be found on these websites are so different and unique from anything that you hear in the modern day, it's kinda hard to even call it straight up hip hop, as it takes influence from techno, metal, rock, screamo, and even weirder stuff like anime soundtracks. As after all, if you were on the internet making music, you probably also had a pretty big interest in anime, and that's why you would start to see AMVs pop off online, being some of the first promotion that these underground artists could get, as after all, if you were somebody who wanted to make an AMV and you wanted to use a mainstream song, you were probably going to get copyrighted, but these random people that you met online would definitely be happy with you using their song. And this is how a lot of people would discover this subculture in the first place. They would go online, look up some form of anime that they liked, see this random AMV video, listen to the song, and say, hey, I actually like that. Let me seek out more. However, we're still talking very, very early underground where there really wasn't any big names that have popped off yet, although it wouldn't be long before we would start to get a couple, with some of the earliest being people like Lil B, Young Lean, and Chief Keef, which are three names that you would never really think that you would hear together, as all three of them are so different. I mean, Chief Keef is a Chicago demon who's always talking about smoking ops and killing people in broad daylight. Young Lean is this weird Swedish kid who raps off beat and talks about getting high on dextromorphine. And Little B is the bass god. You really don't need to have the bass god described to you. If you want it described, go listen to his music. That's what he is.
My thoughts on Little B.
But despite how seemingly different all three of these artists are on the surface, they all had something in common. They were all taking heavy influence from that early internet sound. And because of that, they would all be put under the umbrella of underground. So even this early on, you're starting to see the underground split off into many different genres, with glow from Chief Keef, sad boy rap from Young Lean, and of course the bass sound coming from Little B. Which goes to show that the underground was never really a genre of music, it's just an umbrella term that captures a bunch of genres all together. At this point, I would say it's more of a community, and that's an important word. Community. Because during this period of time, it didn't really matter if you were making loud, aggressive music or whispering jazz music. If you were part of this underground community, you were going to be fucking with everybody in said community. And I think that's a very important building block when it comes to what the underground really is, a sense of community, a sense that everybody is kind of working towards the same thing, that everybody's only a couple clicks away, and that unlike the mainstream industry, there's no borders or walls or labels that can keep people apart, and if you want to make music with somebody that doesn't fit your style at all, you can definitely do that. And you would think a community like this would never be able to find mainstream success, as after all, it's too weird, it's too niche, the people who are part of it probably aren't your average music listener, so there's no way that we're ever going to get a mainstream audience on board. But despite all odds, you would start to see people like Little B get on XXL magazine, as well as Chief Keef only a couple years later. Young Lean would go on to become wildly popular with a couple of viral hits. And while at the time a lot of people were trying to write them off as joke or meme rappers, they would eventually find their respect in the following decade. And once the first couple pioneers really started to pop off from the internet, you would see this style of music bleeding into real life, with many groups being formed around it. With of course Young Lean going on to start Sad Boys, which would eventually spin off into Drain Gang, which became wildly popular in Europe. But who cares about Europe? I mean, we're talking about America here, so let's get back over there. I think the two most important groups to talk about when it comes to early underground internet rap would be ASAP Mob as well as Raider Clan. And while ASAP Mob was definitely doing their thing at the time, I more so want to focus on the latter, because while many people like to give Raider Clan its respect for spawning many popular artists like Xavier Wolf, Denzel Curry, Bones, even though he wasn't a member, but he definitely was an affiliate, but I feel like people always neglect to talk about just how influential they were sound-wise. Because while yes, of course, they took a lot of influence from 3 6 Mafia, Dipset, and overall Memphis Funk, they were able to put enough of an interesting spin on it to turn it into its own thing. Because as much as it pains me to say, there is a good reason that many people consider Space Ghost Perp the father of the modern underground scene, and that all comes down to one project, which of course is called Blackland Radio. 6.6, baby. Now, I truly feel like in the modern day, people don't give this project the respect that it deserves, because in a way, it's kind of on par with Graduation. Now, I know that's a crazy statement. I'm not saying that the musical quality is the same, I'm just saying that it's as influential as Graduation is. Lunacy, insanity, there's no way that you're gonna make that claim, but I really am. Listen to all of the music in Florida that came out before Blackland Radio, and then listen to all of the music that came out after, and you can definitely tell that it's all heavily influenced by this one project. On top of that, in a similar way to Graduation, it doesn't sound dated at all. In fact, it sounds like a project that could come out in the modern day. And while its influence isn't as overt as something like Graduation, it definitely did have a heavy influence on everybody in Florida at the time. I mean, you can hear traces of Blackland Radio in the music that the Suicide Boys makes nowadays, probably the biggest underground act in the world besides maybe Playboi Carti. And in the following years, you would start to see a lot of big name artists spawn off from Raider Clan, like Bones and Team Sesh, Puya and Fat Nick, and of course, well, like I said before, Denzel Curry. However, while I definitely do want to give Florida its props for being so influential on the modern day underground, I don't think this genre of music would have ever gotten as big as it did if it never expanded outside of the state. Because during this time, nobody really looked at Florida as one of the main meccas for rap music, which basically meant that they didn't have the infrastructure available to really push that sound to the next level. There wasn't many radio stations around that could really push the sound. They didn't have a lot of media coverage. And while apps like SoundCloud would eventually help them to push their sound a little bit further, I really don't think it would have ever been able to get as big as it did if it didn't get popular in one of the three big cities, of course being New York, LA, and well, Atlanta. But right off the bat, it doesn't seem like that should be a problem, as after all, ASAP Mob comes from New York, so obviously New York must have been rocking with the sound, right? Well, yes, and also no. What you have to realize is New York is one of the most stubborn places when it comes to hip hop, as they claim that's actually where the genre spawned from in the first place. So what they consider real hip hop and what they don't consider real hip hop is very defined. If it's not boom bap, they basically don't want it. And because of that, you would never really be able to hear the mob on the radio for the following few years. And as stupid and irrelevant as that all sounds now, back in the day, the radio was a lot more important when it came to getting music out there to a broader audience. Not everybody was online at the time, not everybody had SoundCloud, but basically everybody had to drive to work in the morning, and oftentimes when they did, they would listen to the radio. And if you're in a place like New York where there's wall-to-wall gridlock traffic, you're probably going to be listening to a lot of the radio. So unfortunately, New York kind of let the underground down at the time, but luckily for them, Atlanta would pick up the pieces. As while Atlanta can definitely be stuck in its ways from time to time, it's a lot more willing to experiment with different styles of hip hop, and there would be a couple artists that would really pop off at the time that would help to push the wave. And right off the bat, I know a lot of you guys are probably thinking, who are you talking about? There's no real dark trap / emo rap artist who came out of Atlanta at the time that really helped to push the sound, but well, I'm not talking about emo rap or dark trap here. I know in the modern day, people have a very closed off perspective of what should be considered underground rap and what shouldn't, but I'm sorry to tell you, at the time in 2014, 2014 and 2015, people like Playboi Carti, Uno the Activist, and even Lil Yachty were considered underground. You don't have to make depressing music to be considered an underground artist. You just have to be different, unique, and, well, not popular in the mainstream. And well, that's exactly what these three were at the time, and they would really help to push the SoundCloud movement to its next step. Now, I know it's a little bit confusing that I started calling it the SoundCloud movement, as before I was calling it the underground movement, but it's kind of weird the way that it goes. Underground rap eventually morphed into SoundCloud rap, and then SoundCloud rap died, but underground rap continued to exist. It's a little bit confusing, don't think about it too hard. All you really need to know is during this period of time from around 2014 to 2019, it was called SoundCloud rap, and then after that point, it would once again go on to be called underground rap. But anyways, that's besides the point. What I'm trying to say is people like Lil Yachty, Playboi Carti, and Uno the Activist were very influential in the way that they used SoundCloud to their advantage, with them meeting people who had access to big name hip hop playlists, getting their music put on there, helping it to grow before it would then be noticed by the local strip clubs and bars in the area, who would then play their music there. And then before long, the radio stations would also catch on, and all of this SoundCloud type music was now being played on a mainstream platform. They were also super influential for getting platforms like Elevator off of the ground, which would go on to help many underground artists find their voice in the following years. So overall, if you don't want to consider them underground rap, I guess I understand your perspective, but they definitely did a whole lot to help the movement. However, it's not like Florida would completely fall off of the map, because during the time that all of this was going on in Atlanta, Florida was also making big moves with a lot of new artists coming out of the scene, with two in particular being very important, going by the names of XXX Tentacion and Ski Mask the Slump God. Now, unlike many people, I don't consider Ski and X to be the messiahs of the SoundCloud wave and control its life and death, but I will give them props where it's due. They were very influential in two big ways. The first, of course, was that they helped to popularize scream rap, or trap metal if that's what you want to call it, which was a genre that existed for years at this point, but it only was able to find new popularity in 2015 due to people like X and Ski. And yes, there was many other artists who were running with the sound at the time, but none of them were able to get to that level that X and Ski were. However, I think the second of the two ways that they were influential is a lot more important, and that was the shows that they put on, because these guys would show up at random house parties or warehouses and absolutely turn the fuck up, having energy at their shows that we hadn't seen since the 90s. And while many old heads look back at this period of time as a very dumbed down, stupid version of rap music, where people weren't saying anything all that deep in their music, or really anything at all, at the time, kids didn't want to hear some deep meaning in the music. All they wanted to do was turn the fuck up. And when you went to one of these shows, that's exactly what would happen. There was no random awkward kids standing on the walls unwilling to get into the mosh pit. Everybody who was there were all tapped into that energy in the room. And I think that's the second most important thing to mention when it comes to the underground community: energy. Because this wasn't really music that you would listen to think about your life or your choices or feel sad. It was music that you listened to when you wanted to get hyped up. And because everything felt so aggressive and turned up to 11, a lot of kids would hop on board who never even listened to rap music before. But now that we've talked about that, we've covered Florida, Atlanta, New York. The only place missing is LA. So what did they contribute to the SoundCloud scene? Well, basically everything. Because while nowadays Xavier Wolf is definitely a pretty big piece of shit for beating his dog as well as being abusive to his girlfriend, he actually was very influential in the way that he got a little known podcast called No Jumper off the ground. As at the time, Adam 22 was basically only focused on the BMX community and had very little interest in underground rap, but after him and Xavier Wolf began to kick it on the daily, they decided it might be a good idea to sit down and do a podcast. And while at the time No Jumper was nothing more than a simple SoundCloud podcast that probably got about 1,000 to 2,000 listeners on every one they dropped, it would eventually grow into a massive brand that would really help the SoundCloud wave shine, as they would eventually expand onto YouTube, interviewing people like the Suicide Boys as well as Puya and Fat Nick, which would help them to get their initial attention. And then after that, basically every kid who wanted to be a SoundCloud rapper would fly out to LA in hopes of getting a chance to be on the podcast. And at the time, time, that was a lot easier than you may think, as at the time they were actually filming the podcast in the back room of the On Some Shit store, which basically meant that any random kid who came off the side of the street could try to get into the room and get their face on camera, and because of that, the entire podcast felt extremely chaotic, which fit in perfectly with the chaotic energy of the SoundCloud wave, as it felt like basically anything could happen. They would go on live stream and a bunch of random YouTubers would show up, and then Boot Gang would be there completely drunk out of his mind and he would pass out, and then some random guy would run him with a gun and stick up Adam 22, which unfortunately led to the end of this chaotic era, but at the same time, it goes to show that basically anything could happen at No Jumper, and because of that, it didn't feel like some stale, sanitized podcast, it felt like a piece of the culture. And from there, things would only get bigger and bigger, as you would start to see a lot of YouTube channels pop up, made for the specific purpose of promoting underground artists, with places like Astari, which would go on to promote emo rappers, Trash AMV, which was mostly for scream rappers. Of course, Elevator had all the crazy colorful hair and face tat people, and then Worldstar Hip Hop would also get on the bandwagon. But the most important of all of these platforms was definitely Lyrical Lemonade, because if you're any sort of rapper who looked crazy in any way, getting a music video on this channel basically assured that you would blow up overnight. And from here, you basically know the story. From 2014 to 2019, SoundCloud rap was at its peak, with several new artists popping out of the wave almost every single month, a bunch of big hits on the Billboard Hot 100, and it really felt like the underground was finally becoming the mainstream. Although a lot of the earliest pioneers who really started this all off weren't getting the respect that they needed, because at the time, while Suicide Boys, Ghostmane, Puya were all pretty big artists, they weren't as big as, say, Lil Pump or XXXTentacion. I mean, they would get a massive bump after Lil Peep passed away, which is unfortunate that one of the prime artists from that movement had to die for people to take notice, but that's oftentimes how things go, unfortunately. However, while this would help to get their names out there a little bit more, they never really reached the same peaks as some of the biggest artists from SoundCloud. I mean, the Suicide Boys were big, but they definitely weren't Travis Scott. So when the time came in 2019 for the entire wave to start slowing down before eventually dying altogether in 2020, once the mainstream decided that they were going to completely disregard this entire sound, the underground scene would manage to survive. And in fact, they would thrive, because in 2020, with the birth of TikTok, you would see a lot of these artists who during the prime time of SoundCloud rap were considered B tier to C tier artists become the biggest names in the entire game. I mean, I can't really describe to a modern fan how crazy it is to see how big the Suicide Boys are nowadays, because when I was a teenager, you rarely heard people listen to them. I mean, they were definitely big within their own fan base, but they weren't so big that absolutely everybody had heard of them. So while unfortunately the SoundCloud wave had to die for the underground to thrive, the underground was finally thriving, and it would continue on into 2021. However, unfortunately, this is really where you would start to see the culture of the underground change in a big way, because after all, now with everybody being on the internet and so many different people wanting to be rappers, you would start to see certain sounds get extremely watered down. And what once felt like a thriving community where a new artist would pop off almost every single month was now failing to produce any new talent. At least if you're focused on emo rap and dark trap, but if you take a look over to Plugin B with groups like Slay World, those genres were thriving. And while I never really got on board with this entire movement during the time that it was popular, you have to give them props, because many artists from that group would go on to become incredibly popular, like Can, Summers, and of course, Yeet. However, what some people tend to forget is that at that same time, trap metal was really becoming a big genre as well, with it of course taking a little bit of a hit after XXXTentacion passed away and people like 6ix9ine got locked up, but was managing to rebound in a big way. I mean, at the time, it was basically neck and neck with Plugin B, which sounds crazy now considering how big one genre became and how dead the other one is, but it's true, believe it or not. But the biggest issue that trap metal had at the time is that they didn't really have their own version of Slay World, because while Slay World definitely was a group that had a popular name of its own, it was the fact that so many of these artists were able to stand out and build their own solo careers off the back of that group that really helped to push that genre to the next level. And trap metal just didn't have a version of that. Well, we had Spider Gang, I guess, but let's be honest, Spider Gang was so weird and disjointed and crazy that it's hard for a mainstream audience listener to really get invested. And that's probably the reason that you've only really seen 3 of the over 10 members go on to do really big things, while the rest of them aren't really failing but never really managed to expand outside of the box of the underground. But when all hope was lost, we did have one artist who would be able to carry us through into the mainstream. And believe it or not, that was actually Tokyo's Revenge. Yes, I know nowadays he's hated for very good reason, but at the time, a lot of people looked at him as the main face of the genre. He was just palatable enough for a mainstream audience to want to listen, while also being respectful to the rest of the underground, doing songs with Josiah and other big names from trap metal, and it really felt like he was going to bridge that gap. But then, unfortunately, you already know what happened. I don't have to repeat it again. And after that, trap metal didn't really have a face or a star. And on top of that, when your biggest name is accused of something like that, it's not a very good look for the genre as a whole. And then it went on to happen a second time, but that's besides the point. And because of that, after 2021, trap metal would basically become irrelevant, where all the Cardi clones and people like Yeet would continue to thrive, basically changing the entire face of the underground. And while to many this was a good thing, people who liked that style of music were feeling very resentful. They didn't blame Tokyo's Revenge for fucking up the whole movement or the genre as a whole for being unwilling to move on. They instead focused their attention on the people who were successful. It's not fair. Why do all those artists get the opportunities that we don't? Why won't media give us any coverage? They're trying to stack the deck against us. They're trying to play the game unfairly. And you would see this resentment bubble over and turn into straight up hatred. And I think this is really where you started to see the underground scene get splintered off into different genres. No longer was it all one unified underground scene where emo rappers would hang out with people like Lil Pump. Now it had to be classified. You see, people like Cardi and Opium, they're not real underground. They're mainstream artists trying to use the underground style to get themselves popular. Real underground is people like us, City Morgue, Ghostmane, Puya, Suicide Boys. And with all this gatekeeping going on, it would scare away a lot of new fans who would be interested in the genre but couldn't really get their foot in the door because it was way too confusing, and anytime they tried to ask any questions, they would be hit with a lot of pushback. And I think this all happened because after the dark underground, if you want to call it, didn't manage to get the same sort of success as the light underground, I guess we're gonna call it. I don't really know. You started to see people get very, very protective over what they considered their music. As after all, a lot of people discovered the Suicide Boys by going on SoundCloud, finding a random track, and then completely falling in love with it. So now that they were becoming mainstream, it felt like a big betrayal. And I know I keep using them as an example over and over again, but really this is a lot broader of an issue than just the Suicide Boy fan base, although they definitely are a pretty good representation of this entire issue, but it goes farther than that into the entire dark underground, which is a term that I don't think I'm ever going to get used to. And this has led many artists who have found a lot of popularity within that space to become permanently stuck, because if they try to do anything new or really go outside of the box, their fan base is going to be super upset with them, but if they continue to make that same old style of music, they're not going to gain any new fans. And this has left underground hip-hop feeling like it's been stuck in the same old place for the past 5 years, with a bunch of emotionally stunted fans who can't move on past 2018 and constantly want their favorite artists to keep doing the same old thing that they were doing over 7 years ago at this point. But once again, they don't blame themselves, they blame the media. So why does the media not cover this part of the underground? It's because it's way too oversaturated. Back in the day, No Jumper was able to find big name artists before they blew up because the scene was relatively smaller. I mean, it was kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. If you interviewed 10 rappers, it was very likely that at least one of them was going to end up becoming a big name. But nowadays, it's kind of like fishing in the entire ocean, but at the same time, the ocean is segmented off into 4 different pieces, and if you try to fish in one when you've already fished in the other, people are going to shit on you for switching up. So most people just don't bother anymore, and they instead focus on what the most popular thing is at the time. And oftentimes that's basically some form of clown, because it's so hard to get your music and name out there nowadays with everybody ever being online and most kids wanting to be an artist, that you have to pull antics and do bullshit to even get yourself noticed. And that's why we seem to see a never-ending parade of gimmick rappers, because the only thing that can actually get noticed nowadays is gimmicks. And while you can sit there and blame the artist for that, it's not really their fault. It's more so the landscape of the internet nowadays. Everybody has such a short attention span, everybody's already so stuck in their ways that they're not willing to listen to anything new, and because of that, if you want to stand out, you have to do something stupid. So, what do we do about all of this? Is there any way that we can actually change the underground and make it better, or are we permanently stuck in a death spiral with the modern internet eroding our culture over and over again? Well, the answer is very simple. All you have to do is get out of your comfort zone. I understand that you might particularly like this one genre, underground rap, and think it's the best out of all of them, and that's perfectly fine. But you should also be willing to listen to a different style of music as well. I'm not saying that you have to go from listening to Little Darky to somebody like Shay, because of course that's a pretty big jump, but you could listen to somebody who's a little bit outside of your comfort zone. On top of that, don't be upset when your favorite artist tries to do something a little bit different, because the more you push back on them to make the same old style, the more and more irrelevant they're going to become, because eventually most of the audience is going to get tired of that style. And I'm not trying to blame the audience here either, because trust me, I get it. When you're a teenager, those are some of the best years of your life, and all of the music that you listen to during that period is probably going to be your favorite music of all time. In fact, they say that most people don't really change their musical tastes after the age of 26. I get it, guys. That was a time in your life that was less stressful. You had less to worry about, and it felt like the world was a lot more inviting and open than it probably does now. But we gotta let it go. Not completely let it go and forget about it, but just be willing to give some other music a chance. And if we can just stop gatekeeping and trying to push people out of the genre and constantly saying that our version of events are right and that everybody else is wrong, I think we'll once again become a much more open community where new fans are willing to get involved. But I'm not just talking out of my ass and telling all you guys to get off your butt and do something. I'm also going to try to be the change that I want in the world, and I'm going to be using this channel in the future to try to promote artists that I feel like are really doing something outside of the box. In fact, I actually have 2 videos planned, with one artist being somebody who was never able to move on or grow, being constantly stuck in the same old nostalgia, and the second video is going to be somebody who completely switched up their style and ended up becoming more popular than ever. Yep, we're going to be taking a look at both sides of the coin, and then after that, I'm going to continue to try to promote people who I feel like are creative, out of the box, and doing something different. So if you enjoy that and want to see more, definitely stick around, hit subscribe, like the video if you liked it. And if you feel like I'm selling out and moving on and betraying all the old fans that I had before, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but unfortunately in life we have to grow, we have to change, and if you're willing to stick around with me on that journey, that would be appreciated, but if not, I understand too. I hope you find your own path in life, and hopefully someday you can find a type of music that makes you feel the same way that you felt when you were a teenager. I for sure am looking for that, and I'm sure many others are as well. But with that said, tune in next time for more Skibbity Riz Fortnite compilations. I will see you there, guys. Peace out. Bye.